If my people, who are called by my name, would humble themselves and pray, if they would seek my face, harness prayer to action, turn from their wicked ways, then will I hear from heaven, I will forgive their sins and heal their land. I'll pray for you, you pray for me, and watch God change things. How grateful I am to be here with you tonight. It's great to be at Union Theological Seminary once again. Although as I look on the faces of people who taught me here and who learned here with me, I can't think of a more intimidating place for me to stand and preach. I mean that sincerely, and I've been a few places. I'm grateful, however, for the invitation. And I am especially honored to stand as part of this preaching series named in honor of Dr. Henry Mitchell, who is the dean of preachers in a very real sense, whose work is formative and important for understanding black preaching and black belief, and who is a member of the Ebenezer Baptist Church. And for the last few years, I had the dubious honor of standing up and preaching at Ebenezer Church with Henry Mitchell and the sister of Martin Luther King Jr., Christine King Farris, sitting in front of me. So some days I just preach with my eyes closed. I left Dr. Mitchell a message. He called me earlier this afternoon to express his regrets. He wanted so badly to be here. He has moved from Atlanta to be with his daughter in New Jersey, and he wanted to be here tonight. But we thank God for him and for Ella Mitchell. They are indeed true trailblazers, that they were both here students, I believe, in the late 30s and 40s is amazing. That Ella Mitchell was here in the 40s as a black woman is extraordinary. And although she has passed on from among us and he is not here tonight, I think they both deserve our applause and our great thanks. I want to thank the president, Sister President Serene Jones, for her leadership, and Fred Davey, thank you so much. Dr. James Cone, who was my principal advisor and who advised the dissertation which has become a book. I'm grateful to see him here tonight, and I'm thankful for his friendship and his mentorship across the years. To all of my professors, Janet Walton and others, I'm afraid I'm going to miss somebody. And Norris Chumley, with whom I studied, who's now a professor, director, producer, Emmy Award winner, best-selling author. My God, you make me feel like a slacker, but it's good to see you, Norris Chumley. Thank you so much, all of my sisters and brothers, for your witness. I'm just grateful to be a part of this experience. Now I see a few members of Abyssinian Baptist Church, and because that church did so much for me, would you please stand, give Reverend Butts my regards. If you're a member of Abyssinian Church or a previous member of Abyssinian Church, stand up. Thank you so much. I'm glad to see you. Let us pray. Grant, O God, that the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts would be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. All of these died in faith without having received the promises. But from a distance, they saw and greeted them. I want to talk about unfinished business. All of these died without having received the promises. In the interest of full disclosure, let me say that I did not choose this text. The committee chose this text. But I like this text. It's a good text. It is the summarizing testimony and grand culmination of an auspicious list of heroes and, if you will, sheroes who show us what it means to stand by the highest and the best, what it means to keep the faith while walking through the flood or standing in the fire. There is a great list on both sides of these verses that were read in your hearing. I call it the Hall of Faith. These verses and the words inscribed therein represent the plaque that hangs over the hall. But if you were to read the 11th chapter in its entirety, it would be as if you were walking down the corridors of the Hall of Faith. What a great hall. Trailblazers are there. Abel is there. Noah is there. Abraham, father of the faith and deadbeat dad, is there. Sarah is there. Hagar should have been listed there. She is exiled in life and exiled off the list. I wonder why. But Joseph, the great dreamer, is there. Moses, liberator and lawgiver, is there. The people who dared go with him across the Red Sea are there. Rahab, the sex worker, is there. Unnamed and unnumbered. Martyrs are there in this great hall of faith, and the huge plaque that hangs there reads, "All of these died in faith without having received the promises. But from a distance they saw and greeted them. They desire a better country." The very next chapter calls them a great cloud of witnesses. And curiously enough, the resume and moral dossier of each distinguished inductee begins with the same two words, by faith. By faith, Abraham obeyed. When he was called to set out for a place he was to receive as an inheritance. By faith, Moses left Egypt. And for the most part, I like this list. There are some gaps in it. I don't know who met to compose the list. That's why during this Black History Month and this Trailblazers season, if I could get an audience, if you will, with the divine council, I would seek to be recognized by the chair. And being recognized by the chair, I would have a few names that I would like to add to the list. In this 50th year of the Civil Rights Act, you might not be surprised that I would like to add the name Martin Luther King Jr. to this list, but Coretta Scott King ought to be on this list, and Rosa Parks ought to be on this list, and Fannie Lou Hamer, who stood and told the nation that she was sick and tired of being sick and tired. I think she ought to be on the list. Della Baker ought to be on the list, and Bayard Rustin ought to be on the list. Fred Shuttlesworth, who was too crazy to be scared, ought to be on this list. And then there are some other lesser-known names, some names that will never appear in the New York Times, some names that are not written in the history books, but my grandmother, who lived through the dark days of Jim Crow, down south and up south, and yet kept the faith, ought to be on this list. Big Mama and Little Mama ought to be on this list. Ella Mitchell should be on this list. And I wonder, in the spirit of the black church, our call and response tradition, if there is anybody here who's got some pioneer of the faith who died in the faith that you would add to this list. Testify. Chair is still a chair. Well, having gotten the attention of the divine council, sisters and brothers, I move that these sisters and brothers be added to the list. Anybody want to second the motion? All in favor, let it be known by saying amen. Amen. Well, let the record reflect. And let the heavens agree that all these died without having received the promises. But from a distance they saw and greeted them. In other words, they died with unfinished business. And every child of God, every true believer, ought to live her life engaged in a project that's larger than her lifetime. That's really all I came from Atlanta to say. Martin Luther King Jr. said that if a man hasn't found something he's willing to die for, he isn't fit to live. Every child of God ought to be engaged in a project in your life that's larger than your lifetime. If you can consume and finish the project, it's not large enough. Yes, yes. And so Dr. King lived his life in that way. He used to talk about the triplet evils of racism, poverty, and war. And he was so sophisticated in his understanding, he understood the relationship between the three things, racism and poverty and war. And the deeper he went in the struggle, the deeper was his thinking. And the deeper was his thinking, the deeper he went into the struggle. And his witness is sorely needed now for a black church that is radical on race, but conservative on almost everything else. He understood the interrelationship between these things, and he knew that he wouldn't finish. He wouldn't finish, and that's why perhaps Dr. King used to talk about Franz Schubert's Unfinished Symphony. It's a beautiful and magnificent symphony, but it only has 2 movements. Most symphonies, I believe, have 4 movements. This one only has 2, and many have wondered why didn't he ever finish the symphony? And Dr. King used to say that's the way life is. Life is an unfinished symphony. And those of you who are here doing this work, you carry on. Sometimes it feels like in your study and in your room all by yourself. But I want you to know that you are a part of a great cloud of witnesses. You are a part of an unfinished symphony, and as we look at what goes on in our world today, can there be any doubt that there's still a whole lot of work that needs to be done? And I just want to suggest tonight that we ought to continue to work on that unfinished symphony about which Dr. King used to speak. After all, we're still dealing with racism in America's post-racial world. And we're still dealing with poverty. And we're still dealing with war. Can I talk about poverty for just a little while? Especially on this day in which the Congress just a few hours ago failed to extend unemployment insurance to tens of thousands of Americans who need unemployment insurance. There's a kind of mean-spiritedness in America for several presidential cycles now. For about the last 25 years or so, poor people have been so effectively maligned that you can't even use the word poor in American political discourse. On both sides of the aisle, nobody really talks about poor. And then all of a sudden, in recent days, politicians have decided that it's all right at least to talk about income inequality. It is because poor people have been so maligned that it is almost criminal just to be poor. Think about it. They won't extend unemployment insurance because the logic is if you extend unemployment insurance, this will be a disincentive to go to work. And people ought to really work because work brings dignity to people's lives. I believe that. But then the same Congress refuses to raise the minimum wage. And so the same people who refuse to provide unemployment insurance to people who can't find work also refuse to make work pay. Poor people cannot get a break. We're still dealing with poverty. We're dealing with the widening gap between the haves and the have-nots. I'm at Union Seminary, so I know that this sophisticated crowd knows that the top 1% now owns about 40% and more of the nation's wealth. It takes the average worker 1 month, the average worker, not the lowest paid worker, the average worker with a college degree in many cases, 1 month to earn what the CEO earns in 1 hour. Increased productivity and profits do not translate into increased prosperity for those who make prosperity possible. Wealth is trickling up and not trickling down. Pope Francis, who is my pope? I'm a Protestant, but these days I've got a pope. Calls trickle-down economics a crude and naive trust that somehow wealth just automatically trickles down. And meanwhile, the excluded, he said, are still waiting. And there were those who got angry with the Pope. And because there's such a vacuum of authentic spirituality in America today that gives itself voice in the public square, that we don't even recognize it when it shows up. And so some began to call the Pope a Marxist. And I love this Pope. He said, well, I'm not a Marxist, but I know a few Marxists, and they're pretty good people. So hard to discover and to hear an authentic vision and voice of authentic spirituality that gives voice to the least of these, that when it shows up, people describe it as some strange ideology rather than the vision of that poor Palestinian prophet who said that the Spirit of the Lord is upon me because God has anointed me to preach good news to the poor, to open the eyes of the blind, to set the captives free, to preach the year of the Lord's favor. We're still dealing with poverty. Poor people have been so maligned. And we need to be reminded that most poor people are children. And we people of faith have to stand up and say, stop talking about poor people like they're not people. Most poor people are children. And in America today, it's expensive to be poor. You live in a poor neighborhood, you're probably dealing with inferior goods at extreme prices, working 2 or 3 jobs, trying to make $1 out of 15 cents. You might live in a city like Atlanta where public transportation is horrible. You saw that last week, didn't you? And you move around trying to work 3 jobs, trying to figure out how to handle child care, and if you get sick, you got to take some time off the job, and you get paid hourly in order to see the doctor, and if you lose your job, you lose your health care. It's expensive to be poor. And most poor people are children. I know because I was one of those children. People like to tell folk to pull themselves up by their own bootstraps, to make it happen. There's all of this moralizing when it comes to poor people about the work ethic. And that's why Dr. King used to say that it's strange how we have Marxism for the rich and rugged free enterprise for the poor. I had a father who taught me how to work hard. He was from the old school. He used to wake me up, Fred Davy, early on a Saturday morning and say, just put on your shoes and get ready to go to work. And I said, Dad, what am I going to do? He said, I don't know what I'm going to have you do, but just be ready. And he instilled in me this work ethic, and I took that work ethic with me all the way to Morehouse College and made it through Morehouse College and made it through Union Theological Seminary. Yes, because I worked hard, but guess what? Somebody gave me a Pell Grant. Somebody gave me a low-interest student loan. In other words, somebody provided some ladder of opportunity. We're still dealing with poverty, and we're still dealing with racism. And we could talk all night about racism, but just about everywhere I go these days, I talk about what I see as the most obvious sign of the lingering legacy of racism in America today, and that's America's prison industrial complex. I talk about the prison industrial complex because it's worse now than it was during the ministry and the activism of Martin Luther King Jr. Dr. King and those who marched with him could not have imagined that we would be dealing with the kind of system with which we are dealing with now. There were about 300,000 people in America's prisons in 1980. Today we have over 2 million in America's prisons. Most of them, over 50% of them, are African American, and over 50% of them are there for non-violent, drug-related offenses. The United States of America is 5% of the world's population. We house 25% of the prison population. We've got more people in prison than they have in China and in Saudi Arabia and in Iran and in North Korea and all of the other regimes whose human rights abuses we like to deplore. More African Americans under supervision than were in slavery in 1850. And even as we celebrate Nelson Mandela, we ought to remember that the United States has a greater percentage of its black population in prison than did South Africa at the height of apartheid. That is the kind of regime under which we are living these days, and our children, black boys and brown boys who are lined up every day in American courtrooms in cities all across this country, deal with this prison industrial complex, nonviolent, drug-related offenses. And many of them, some of them don't even go to prison. They just take a plea. And the ugliness of the system is that it doesn't matter. Some of them don't even go to prison, but they take a plea and they think, well, let me get out of this so I can go on with my life. But the truth is they have a life sentence, because after they carry the ugly stigma of convicted felon, all of the discriminations against which Dr. King and others of his generation fought all of a sudden become legal, because black bodies have once again been stigmatized by what Gunnar Myrtle calls the American dilemma. And so job discrimination becomes legal. Housing discrimination, legal. Voting discrimination, legal. College aid discrimination. All of these things, legal. Again, it is what Michelle Alexander called it. It is the new Jim Crow. Dealing with racism, dealing with poverty, And then finally, we're still dealing with war. There's never enough money to do what we ought to do to finish America's unfinished business with poverty. But isn't it interesting how we always have enough money for the weapons of warfare, and we can talk about the problems with our foreign policy, but nowadays we are increasingly at war with one another. There's a kind of politics of fear and suspicion that is destroying the soul of America. And that's why even after Sandy Hook, we could not get reasonable gun reform passed through our Congress. Just yesterday, I testified before the state legislators at the Georgia Capitol. Georgia has some of the most lax gun laws in the country. Georgia's idea of gun control is whether you can hold your rifle straight. With all of the lax gun laws in Georgia, they've decided that they're not lax enough. We've got the 5th highest population of uninsured individuals, and with all of the issues, we're almost last in education. We haven't figured out how to provide health care to all of these uninsured people. The governor will not expand Medicaid, and in the midst of all that's going on, I had to go to the Capitol yesterday because they've decided that what we really need is more guns and more access to guns by more people in more places. And so somebody decided that they had a bright idea to pass a piece of legislation that will allow for guns and concealed weapons to be carried in churches. Have you ever been to a church meeting? That's the last place. God's Christian people aren't always there. Whoever thought of that had never been to a church meeting. And guns in bars, where people have taken leave of their senses, and guns on college and university campuses, and guns in airports. And so we stood just yesterday begging our state legislators not to pass this terrible law. But the beauty of it all was that as we were making our case, there were Christian ministers standing there, Jewish rabbis and Muslim imams, people of faith gathered to give voice to a greater vision of what America is all about. So we've got some unfinished business, and so I hope you'll study hard and work hard and pray hard and struggle on behalf of a project that's larger than your lifetime. And don't become so self-absorbed that you think it's all about you. It's larger than you. Every now and then when I need to be inspired, I look up into the heavens. Not to see a vision of God's face, but sometimes I look up just to see geese flying. What I like about geese is that geese fly in a V formation. Pelicans flap their wings faster, but they don't get as far as fast. Geese have figured out the aerodynamics of flying. They fly in a V formation. Believe it or not, the one out front is getting all of the glory. The wind is blowing against his face, but he's working the hardest. The one out front is working the hardest, but what I like about geese is that every now and then the one that's out front, the one that gets all of the recognition, grows tired. And when the one out front grows tired, without a vote, without a church fight, without the geese on one side of the formation deciding to shut the whole geese formation down, One just moves toward the back and the other one moves closer to the front because geese understand that my individual location is not as important as our collective destination. And what I want to know is, does America have as much sense as a goose? We are afraid of one another. And yet God is calling us, even in the midst of the strife and the madness, to continue some unfinished business. That old narrative of racism is still with us, poverty is still with us. We're at war too often with one another. About 2 years ago, a young man who would have celebrated his 19th birthday on yesterday lost his life. Trayvon Martin was caught up in the tragic matrix of racism and the proliferation of guns and a culture of violence. He was caught up in the maddening matrix of a culture that sees young men like him not as a person, but as a problem. And so he was blown away that night, not simply a casualty of George Zimmerman, but of America's unfinished business with this very old problem. Zimmerman blew him away, said that he looked suspicious. He looked like he was a threat. Why did he look like he was a threat? Why did he look like he was suspicious? Because he was wearing a hood. I heard that and I thought that was interesting. A young black man looked frightening and threatening because he was wearing a hood. But as this young man lost his life, he died, I believe, with a message in his hand. He was carrying a pack of Skittles. I know him at Union Seminary, and you're used to people saying much more sophisticated things, but he was carrying a pack of Skittles. Exegete this. Skittles are a packet of multi-flavored, multicolored, refreshing treats tied together in a single package. Any 8-year-old child who's never been to biblical Hebrew or systematic theology will tell you that there's no such thing as eating a Skittle. You can eat one Skittle, it tastes okay, but if you really want your mouth to explode, you have to put all of the Skittles in your hand at the same time and put them all in your mouth with all of their variegated colors and flavors in your mouth at the same time, because Skittles, like us, are much better together. E pluribus unum, red, yellow, brown, black, and white. We're all precious in God's sight. We're better together. Some are straight and some are gay, but we're better together. Some are rich and some are poor, but we're all better together. And God calls us to do some unfinished business, and every now and then when I grow tired of the work God has called me to do, I'm mindful of the fact that in the Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia, there is this phenomenon called Cedar Creek. Cedar Creek is a tiny little creek. If you ever saw it, it doesn't look very impressive, but it's done an impressive thing. Across the years, Cedar Creek has managed to press its way through the mighty rock of a mountain. A tiny little creek, yet like a surgeon's knife, it's cut its way through a mountain. But if you were to go and ask Cedar Creek, what makes you so bad? How in the world did you manage to push through that mountain? The creek would say, don't look at me. If you really want to see something impressive, you ought to go and talk to the James River, because the creek gets its strength from the river. The river pushes the creek, and the creek makes its way through the mighty mountain. But if you were to go and talk to the river and say, "River, what makes you so bad?" And you say, what do you mean? Well, the river pushes the creek, and the creek has made its way through the mountain. The river would say, "Oh, don't look at me. If you really want to see something impressive, you ought to go to the Chesapeake Bay down in Hampton, Virginia. Matter of fact, I have to go through there every 24 hours, and it's the bay that pushes the river, and the river pushes the creek, and the creek has made its way through a mighty mountain. But if you were to go and talk to the Chesapeake Bay, the bay would say, "Don't look at me. If you really want to see something impressive, you ought to go and talk to the Atlantic Ocean." And since I'm from Savannah, Georgia, can I tell you one day, yes, I had a conversation with the Atlantic Ocean. And I said, "Atlantic Ocean, what makes you so bad? How in the world have you managed to do what you've done?" The ocean said to me, "What do you mean?" I said, "Well, look at you. The ocean is pushing the bay, and the bay has pushed the river, and the river pushes the creek, and the creek has made its way through a mighty mountain." You know what the ocean said to me? "Don't look at me. I get my strength and power from the God who orchestrates the sublime movement of ocean currents, the God who presides over the world. And when you grow tired like Cedar Creek, know that behind you is a mighty ocean of God's great humanity, a cloud of witnesses that came before us. And they bid us and cheer us on. Keep the faith. Keep looking up."